Hi, I'm Eric, and this is The Clans of the Scottish Highlands by James Logan and R.R. McIan. You've probably seen images of these books all over the internet, and you may even own a reproduction of one of the richly colored illustrations. Actually, you may even own or have seen in an antique shop pages of this book cut out and mounted as wall art. This set here with me is one of a few surviving specimens of the original printing from 1845, and was purchased by a friend of ours at Sotheby's some time ago. And just to set the record straight, we are being extremely careful with this object while it's in our care and following recommended curatorial practices. Okay, so you may be thinking, wow, gorgeous book, but what else is there to say about it? Well, what I want to describe for you briefly is what this book represents: the Tartan craze of the 19th century, and the legacy that we have inherited from it. First, we need to go back 100 years before this book was created. Tartan hasn't always been as popular as it is now. Following the Jacobite rebellions of the 18th century, anti-Scottish sentiment swept across England. After the defeat of Charles Edward Stuart, Parliament feared another bloody rebellion was just a matter of time, so they took action to limit the influence of various groups across Scotland, especially the Highland clans. The display of rallying symbols of Jacobitism were outlawed. The most famous of the so-called prescriptions was the Dress Act of 1746. This is the law that forbade the wearing of traditional Highland wear across Scotland. The goal was to weaken Scottish cultural identity, which of course at the time was more of a Highland thing. These measures lasted for about 40 years, and they were difficult to enforce in rural areas, but they did have an effect. Traditional Highland wear, including the kilt, largely fell out of fashion. However, tartan never really died, it was just waiting for a chance to return. Now, there's nothing more evil than an enemy that you're afraid of. Conversely, there's nothing more romantic than an enemy whom you have defeated, especially if you feel a little guilty about winning. It's a pattern you see throughout history, from ancient Rome to the American West. In the young but rapidly expanding Empire of Britain, this pattern applied to the Scots. By the late 1700s, the empire needed troops and working men more than ever, and the new middle class and the smart nobility set developed a fascination with Scotland. The landscape that they could now explore on holiday, the old quaint customs, the tragic romance of a primitive warrior people, and of course tartan. All this was part of an international zeitgeist that we now call Romanticism. It was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that rejected the stiff rationalism of the Enlightenment. Fueled by nostalgia, medieval history, and nature, Romanticism emphasized individualistic, nationalistic, and emotional responses to life. Think Rousseau, Lord Byron, and Beethoven. And that background brings us to this man, Walter Scott. Born in 1771, Scott was an avid lover of Scottish history and culture, and a true romantic. Despite being formally trained as a lawyer, his real passion was writing, and he would go on to pen a series of novels and epic poems that brought a powerful romantic view of Scottish history to life. Scott became an international sensation. He was even offered the position of British Poet Laureate at one point, though he did decline. Now, Scott was not just in this for the fantasy or for profit. He was part of an intelligentsia that truly desired Scotland's return to greatness. And to do that, these men needed to establish a national identity, one rooted in the past but also energized by the current day. Scott was a leader and the chief propagandist of this movement. His crowning achievement was formally reintroducing Scotland to the rest of Britain through a royal visit. In 1822, he was able to use his popularity to convince King George IV to visit Scotland, and this was absolutely momentous. You see, this was the first time in nearly 170 years that any British monarch had traveled to Scotland. It was political theater like never seen before. Ostensibly, the visit was intended to boost the popularity of a deeply unpopular king in a region where relations had been deteriorating for decades. In reality, the visit was part of a plan by Parliament to distract the king while they handled post-Napoleonic negotiations at the Congress of Verona. George was a bit of an embarrassment. Walter Scott, now Sir Walter Scott, Baron of Abbotsford, managed much of the pomp and circumstance for the event, often giving advice to the king and planning key parts of the ceremonies and festivities himself. One result was that he convinced George to wear the proper Highland dress during his visit, or as Scott liked to put it, the garb of the old Gaul. And of course, if the king was wearing a tartan kilt, you, as a Scottish elite, had better wear one too. Suddenly, everyone needed Highland dress, and every clan chief needed a tartan, whether his family had ever used one or designated one or not. The visit, in short, was a massive success, and turned interest in Scottish culture into a veritable bonfire. The so-called tartan craze had truly arrived. Now that it was safe, acceptable, and fashionable, tartan and Scottish culture became symbols of pride for the British Empire. Few people were more enthralled with this than a certain young lady from London named Victoria. Born at Kensington Palace on May 24, 1819, Vicky came of age with the Craze. By the time she came to the throne as queen, she was already deeply fascinated with all things Scottish. Her interest is well documented in her writings, her wardrobe, her purchase of the Balmoral estate, her ordering of the restoration of Rosslyn Chapel, etc., etc., etc. So we have her to thank for this book. Her Majesty wanted to do her part to honor and preserve tartan and Highland culture, so she commissioned the creation of a definitive work. Two uniquely qualified individuals won the commission for the clans of the Scottish Highlands: author James Logan and illustrator R.R. McIan. Robert McIan was born in 1803 just outside Inverness. Unfortunately, that's really all we know about his early years. His life does become a bit clearer, however, after 1825, when he began touring with an acting troupe across Britain, performing in a dramatization of the life of Rob Roy. He was about to find a bit of a niche as an actor, portraying the tough Highlander character in various productions. However, Robert had another passion: painting. So he moved to London, continued acting to pay the bills, and developed his skills as an artist. While in London, McIan would join the Gaelic Society of London in 1830. This was a group committed to preserving the Gaelic language and culture in Scotland, and would serve as a major influence on McIan's art. He would use this inspiration to create illustrations of mostly medieval Scotland. The popularity of these fanciful images would lodge McIan firmly in London's art scene. Sadly, he died in 1854, not long after the creation of the clans of the Scottish Highlands. We can only imagine what he might have accomplished had he lived longer. James Logan was born to a wealthy merchant family in Aberdeen, sometime around 1797. He was formally educated and studied to become a lawyer. However, after suffering a head injury while playing sports, he was forced to withdraw from school. Logan bounced around a number of careers before he found success as an author. His first major work was a collection of stories and illustrations, scenes Logan himself had encountered while on a series of walking tours across rural Scotland. The book, The Scottish Gael, or Celtic Manners as Preserved Among the Highlanders, was so popular that he was invited to present a copy of it to King William IV, Queen Victoria's predecessor. Logan spent much of his life documenting Scottish culture as he saw it, and his work has had a large influence on how we see Scottish culture today. Okay, so what actually is the clans of the Scottish Highlands? Well, as you undoubtedly realize, this massive tome is a catalogue of detailed descriptions of traditional Highland dress. The Clans is widely considered to be one of the first comprehensive illustrated records of Highland dress in the world, if not the first. The introduction itself makes that boast, and purports that the work is highly accurate, free from the errors of previous romanticized documents. Logan and McIan were under a lot of pressure to make it so. The list of subscribers for this project, basically the financial backers, included Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, the King of France, various other European nobles, the Royal Academy, the Royal Library of Bavaria, and perhaps most critically, the Highland Society of London, who get their very own full-page acknowledgement in Volume 1 right after the Queen's. So the general sense is that McIan, Logan, and their publisher, Ackerman & Company, knocked it out of the park. From clan chiefs in tartan revival suits to warriors in great kilts and just about everything in between, the clans showcased as many forms of Highland dress as it could. And interwoven with each illustration were exciting histories or legends related to each of the 73 clans represented. all into very heavy, very luxurious 22 by 15-inch volumes. In 1845, the collection was presented and dedicated to Queen Victoria at the centennial commemoration of the last Jacobite uprising. Those original tomes are still maintained by the Royal Collection Trust. The printer, Cook and Company, put the work into mass production soon after its presentation, and by 1847 it was in homes across Britain. I find it difficult to put into words what a thrill it is to be in the presence of this object, of this art and this work of scholarship. If you've ever been to a museum or in an antique store even, and you've been in the presence of an object or gotten to handle something from another age, and you felt to yourself, if only this thing could talk, or what did this thing see? What did the people experience who were handling this same material that I'm handling now? If you're a history nerd, it just gets your heart going, okay? What occurs to me is that what we're looking at here was the high-class, high-end, exotic, and special media of the time. Reading was incredibly important to the Victorians. It was the age of the first public schools, and essentially reading was your passport to entertainment, to fantasy, to education, all of that. So, whereas today, you would have a kid, a young man, probably in his later teens, looking forward to getting something like a PS5 for Christmas. This would have been an amazing gift. This would have been something that you would keep in your collection and hand down as an heirloom. And in fact, the copy that we have received includes an inscription from someone who gave this to someone else in 1895. So they had held on to the book that long before then passing it along to a loved one. That's how precious this was. This was the Lexus, the Cadillac of books, and this was an amazing experience for anyone who owned it. A really priceless and valuable piece of entertainment that would allow you to experience a world that you couldn't live in. And people who are passionate in the Tartan craze, I like to compare them a little bit to Star Wars fans today, or Harry Potter fans. You are always looking for the next piece of content to come out. You are always excited about something new in the franchise. The difference was that where we have pure fantasy at our fingertips with all the electronic media we have, they had books. They had travel if they were lucky. But for a lot of people, this was the closest they ever came to a world that they idolized. And to put yourself in their shoes for just a moment by looking at it is really, really special. Now, as we said, the document purported to be an accurate chronicle. Official information on the major Scottish clans, including their tartans, histories, and noted leaders. Logan interviewed dozens of clan chiefs and others to gather his facts. However, with hindsight, we know that some of the research and interpretations were, well, romantic. Logan and McIan did a fine job, worthy of their royal patron. But they were people of their time, with the resources available to them at that time, as well as the cultural filters of their society. The Victorians in general were often tempted to color the facts to make them conform to their own ideals. So, can we trust the information in these books? Well, let's just say trust but verify. The work of separating fact from myth has occupied Scottish historians for decades. So, can you trust the book? Why should you study the book? One of my favorite parts is this image for the Fergusons and the copy that goes with it, which on this page says, "In accordance with the plan proposed at the commencement of this work, a figure is introduced clad in one of the oldest garments particular to the Celts. This is called the laine croach, or saffron-colored shirt, which was the habit of people of distinction, and as its name imparts, was dyed of a yellow color from that plant." It goes on to say that the average lanya was like 23 yards of cloth. I don't know where they get that information from. But at the same time, the fact that they even call out the fact that the lanya existed, and they say that it was a precursor of things like the great kilt, is great. All the time when we're talking to customers and viewers about these things, we always run into the myth that the lanya was actually a kilt or something like that. It still persists to this day, and yet 200 years ago, this book was trying to lay it out for people what the facts were, and I just love that. The next major work of any similar focus would not come until 1870, when Kenneth Macleigh's Watercolors of Queen Victoria's Staff at Balmoral was published. And of course, while that collection is beautiful and an accurate representation of Victorian fashion, its scope is minuscule compared to the clans. As for the tartan craze, well, I think it's clear that it has had its ups and downs. After all, the Sobieski Stuarts were a part of it, remember? But the love of tartan and Highland dress is still going strong. It's now a constant for us rather than a craze, though. Not nearly as intense as it was 200 years ago, and yet the art of tartan has never been more widely enjoyed. I feel the hard work of preserving and creating Highland dress was done by those people back then. We just don't have to have the same sense of desperation that Sir Walter Scott felt. We owe all of the true believers of that period a huge debt. Now, if you ever have the chance, I highly recommend perusing and reading the clans. If you want to learn more about the history of tartan in the 19th century, we highly recommend the work of Dr. Rosie Wayne at the Scottish National Museum. The most popular general history of Scotland right now, by the way, is Scotland, The Story of a Nation by Magnus Magnusson. Highly recommend it. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope that your main takeaway is a desire to learn more about Scottish history and culture and about tartan and about Highland dress. That is what the people who started all this really hoped would happen. So it's up to us to preserve their legacy and to carry this art form into the future. So don't ever let it be stale, don't ever let it be statistics, don't ever let it be set in stone. Let it continue to be a passion for you, the way it was a passion for them.